Hey guys, it's Emily Rand with Yahoo Esports, and today I am joined once again by Kelsey Moser, and today we're actually going to do something a little different. Previously we've been doing videos on more making predictions, talking about stylistic matchups between teams, but today we're here to talk about the LPL franchising. So first of all, how are you doing, Kelsey?
I'm doing pretty well, considering it's 2:30 a.m. Yeah, I'm doing pretty well.
Sorry, and thank you. So I guess I'm going to have you lead us off in describing what exactly, this is something they announced at the beginning of the split in a press conference. So I guess just take me through the timeline of when this was first announced and then the more recent announcement.
So they gave a really non-committal announcement where they said that we really want the option of having teams be able to travel to different locations around China so that there's more interaction with fans, and fans don't think of the LPL and gamers as people who just sit and play in their basement. And what goes in hand with that is that they had like the provincial league in Jiangsu kind of testing out having a traveling circuit. Of course, this is a much smaller scale because it's in a single province and there are different options like that. But obviously, if you're having traveling teams, then franchising becomes more attractive because you want to have the same team based in the same location so that it's easier to make this type of like home away game sort of feeling. You can't like relegate the team in Shanghai every week or every split. That probably won't work very well for you. So that's what they announced at the very start of the split, and they said, you know, we're really thinking about this, and they really emphasized that they were thinking about it. And then later it became official following the LPL final when they published a really brief outline of how this will look, where they said they're eliminating relegation. They will still have promotion for a while so that there will be 20 teams eventually. And then they're franchising all of these teams, and all of these teams will slowly move out into cities. Like, it's not going to start out this year where suddenly all the teams are living in Shanghai. It'll probably be like 3 to 6 teams leaving Shanghai for the summer and moving on from there in the subsequent year. So it's not going to be suddenly we're having a different location every week. It'll still primarily be in Shanghai next split.
And then, so that's kind of a combination of the official announcement and then what LGD, what one of LGD's team managers or owners said on stream, where he basically came out and said that he was surprised that other regions were implementing this because under what, or based on what he was told, he thought that it was going to go up everywhere.
Yes.
So I guess like I think that at this point, if you are a League of Legends fan and you've been paying attention to what team owners have been saying, what Riot has kind of been saying between the lines, and then this LPL announcement, like you should kind of be prepared for franchising and possible like geographic relocation coming in soon. I guess from my perspective, I wanted to start off by talking about why franchising is a thing, like how it became the US system. And it basically started with baseball. So when baseball was first organized, they made this thing called the National Association of Baseball Players, which then became the National Association of Professional Baseball Players because teams wanted to pay their players. They wanted a little bit more structure, so basically pay $10 to be a part of this. And there were some teams that are based in major cities, but obviously some of them were just random cities that didn't have a lot of like a natural fan base, basically. And it was still very disorganized. The National League came about in 1876 when this guy named William Hulbert, who was the owner of the Chicago White Stockings at the time, they just basically wanted a more central authority, so a league. And then they also, a huge part of it was territorial rights. So he wanted to make sure that the cities that were participating were more serious. They had to have, I believe, 75,000 people in population or more was one of the requirements. And it basically also, they wanted to be able to do things like hiring umpires and having a more centralized charter or constitution. And this is what evolved as franchising in the US, basically, where teams cannot be eliminated. They make up the league itself. So for the NFL, it's the actual franchises who elect a commissioner that then oversees like NFL operations. He enters bargaining agreements with the players union. And I guess that's the main gap that I see just coming from traditional sports as to where Riot themselves are going to fit into this franchising model. Because previously it's been the team owners kind of making the rules, and that's when you get a lot of other stuff like revenue sharing and broadcast rates. So, and I know China in and of itself, they have a huge streaming culture, but I don't know about stuff like that in terms of like where additional revenue would come from.
Yeah, they didn't really specify the revenue sharing thing, but I do think that the idea of location base. So LPL teams have started to do really interesting like ancillary stuff to create a revenue stream, which is like they will start their own internet cafes, right? That's like you have the EDG brand internet cafe, and you can go, and like the teams themselves obviously don't really make a lot of money. And it's just like this idea of you start to win in your region and then you can build off of that. So I think for that reason, the having a city thing appeals to some of these teams, because then you don't even necessarily have to be as successful in their minds. You don't necessarily have to be as successful because you have a location where you can build things like OMG brand internet cafes in Chengdu, or LGD brand, I don't know, you can merchandise dog bag knockoffs because the
I was going to say cat cafes
knockoffs.
because they have like so many cats in the house. They could just like have people come and hang out with their cats.
Pet the cats, yeah. I don't know if PYL will let them. But the real, so like I can see why this appeals to them on an ancillary level like that. I would say that the way that LPL is run, and this is going to be a bit of a controversial statement, is that it's more owner run than Riot run in China. I do think that the owners themselves had a lot of impetus for this happening. I think that the owners have a lot of control sort of behind the scenes in the LPL compared to some of the other regions. So I can see why this would be something that they really, really hard pushed for instead.
So do you think they'll have, because one of my things is, again, like where Riot themselves will fit in, and I think in North America, we've seen Riot take more of a heavy hand in terms of doing stuff like even the LCS rule set, like within the LCS itself, they're the person who kind of does all of the like stuff like banning players or upholding rules or whatever. That's all been Riot, not team owners. Would you say that, because from what it sounds like, the China already is a little bit more loose with that kind of stuff where the owners have a bit more say. Do you think that will like help or hurt it? And like, where do you see Riot fitting in China itself?
I think that Riot has retroactively tried to get a foothold into China, which is difficult because it was for a really, really long time just the LPL was maintained by Tencent and the League of Legends Association of Chinese Esports primarily. And when I say Tencent, like I should probably clarify that like when Tencent control or run things or whatever or give away rights. It's like there's this romantic notion that Tencent will come save us from Riot and the West or things like this. It's like as long as you're making money, they're just like, yeah, okay, have fun. It's really not. It's kind of an almost Valve-esque approach, right? The famous Thorin metaphor where Valve is if League is like the overbearing, overdoting mother. Like Valve is the babysitter that is ignoring on the phone with her boyfriend while the game is electrocuting himself in the socket. Things like this. So I think Tencent is a bit more like that. And Riot, so League of Legends Association of Chinese Esports, which for people who don't know is actually comprised of the team owners, right? Who are making decisions, who are punishing, like instead of Riot League rulings in the past, we've had LACE rulings. So the Riot ruling thing is really new, and they had some difficulty implementing it because it's like, oh my gosh, we see TBQ playing on White's account on stream because White's had to go somewhere and he wanted TBQ to finish the game for him. You know, it's things like this that it's like, oh my gosh, it's account sharing, we have to punish him. It's like this really weird, awkward implementation of Riot rules that I think has been slowly coming in, and there's a little bit more of an illusion of control that Riot has in China than I think has been the case of NA, where there is actual rulings and things like this. So that's a big major difference between the way that the LPL is run and the way that the NALCS is run. I also think that because of this, it's what happens with the franchising is also going to be dictated a lot by what the owners want and what the owners need. So it might be more of a U.S. sports-based analogy going on in China as well.
That's cool. I'm glad you touched upon like what the owners, because another thing that's really difficult for me to wrap my head around, just because I've typically been one of those people who's like, okay, just let esports be esports, because you don't need territorial rights to like have a League of Legends team, right? Like for baseball or like for other sports franchises, it's perfectly understandable how it came about because of like they want to create fan bases and you want like a physical location. But in terms of China, so like for the US, I think a lot of people are already like, well, all of us are in like LA, Santa Monica area. Would we have to move if franchising does come to North America? And in China, it's even not necessarily, I don't want to say like worse, but the team houses and like the giant sports complexes that they have for these teams, some of which were just built recently, it seems like geographic relocation isn't something that's necessary, and I guess I can't see a benefit of it.
Yeah, I think that when you're in China, you think esports and you think Shanghai. And it's been that way for a really long time. And you have a lot of these team houses don't just have League of Legends teams, right? They have the teams for all the other esports. So I think what's going to happen is they're going to have to build additional team houses in their respective city and have like their other esports based in Shanghai, which in the existing gaming house. I mean, that's, on one hand, that seems like a really, really big expense, and it definitely is. But on the other, I feel like Chinese teams are maybe a little less concerned with return on investment. Like, this is one of the big things that I was trying to emphasize, is that I feel like there are a lot of Chinese teams that just don't care about ROI, and they're like run by the sons of rich businessmen. They have backers that are streaming companies that have only recently started to realize, oh, all of this money we're spending isn't actually, you know, helping us gain a revenue stream. So when you're competing with these types of forces for things like player contracts, it's definitely a game that you lose. Because it's like you have this guy in the corner who's lighting the money on fire, and then you're wondering like why you can't compete with him. It's just a very irrational situation. So I think that there's something to be said for them being willing to move out in that case. The thing that's more concerning for me is that when we've had tournaments that aren't in Shanghai or Beijing, even or Guangzhou, like those some of those main locations, there have still been tech issues because infrastructure is still very much a growing thing in China in terms of stability, and a lot of the internet connection issues are just really bad. So I'm kind of worrying that there will be an inherent disadvantage for some teams, especially if you're going to 20, right? Are you going to have like really, really big major cities that are supporting each of these individual teams? When we take tournaments to these locations, will there be a stable connection in place? Things like this, that is a really major concern that people aren't necessarily talking about as much in the West.
Do
And
they
the other
have?
thing,
Oh no, I was just gonna say, do they have like pre-existing? I guess would they use? Because this is kind of another thing, and I think the answer in North America is that you have a lot of traditional sports orgs entering, so they just hold tournaments at like their sporting facility that they might already
sure.
have. But for these Chinese teams, I guess like, are there even locations, or would they have to build those as well?
I mean, there are probably locations because you still have sporting facilities and things like this. Football is a big thing in China. Um, so I do think, and by football I mean soccer. But there, yeah, there are definitely facilities and locations. That's less the concern to me than the network infrastructure and things like that. It's just a really interesting, like, my biggest thing with it coming to China, of course, isn't even those things. It's the fact that we're constantly introducing teams that are placing top 4, top 5 of 12 in the LPL, like brand new teams at minimum, top 4, top 5. Every split, there's a brand new team that does that, that replaces a team that was not able to win games effectively the previous split. So I think that that's really important, and it indicates that we aren't yet at a like an equilibrium place where franchising really makes a ton of sense. It's like we're going to reward these existing teams like LGD Gaming for every split feeding at the bottom until they're in threat of relegation, and they flat out say we're playing better because we don't want to lose face. Like, they explicitly will say that, you know, we're suddenly playing better because we don't want the cultural shame of relegation and things like this. So I don't know if we're in a position to say, okay, the teams that are in LPL should remain in LPL, and they're going to be good, to use Riot words, long-term partners, you know. But that's, we'll see, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I feel like, as weird as it sounds, I don't mind it for North America, because if that's the way, like, you have all of these kind of VC outfits that usually have one or more traditional sports organizations in them. And as we know, like, esports has this weird nebulous economic prediction where everyone's like, there's money in esports, but like no one really knows how to get it out. It's just kind of this prediction where people are like, oh yeah, there's like definitely money, it's a growing industry, but then a lot of the return on the investment won't be immediate. And I'm still really concerned with how, like, if there's broadcasting rights even, or like how Riot's even going to handle that, how orgs themselves are going to negotiate with players, because I feel like the players are kind of being left completely out of this almost, because it's not like they can unionize and fight for their own rights, which is something that's pretty huge in major sports. And that's actually why you see like lockouts sometimes, because they'll be, you know, like the players actually have bargaining power, whereas I don't see any League of Legends players having bargaining power. But with all that said, even with all those reservations, I can definitely see why in North America they would want to do this, because it's what teams are used to. And even if the system is archaic if that's what you have to do to get some of these orgs to invest for the future and you're looking at it long term, then whatever. But in terms of looking at other regions like China, which is going to be the first to implement it, but then Korea, I don't see how will work in Korea. I don't see how it'll work in Europe. Because again, like not only is Europe completely, like the franchising system's completely foreign to Europe, but then also piggybacking on your point about LPL teams, in Europe, we've also seen if you do not do well in LCS, you will get kicked out by challenger teams. And not only do they have challenger teams, but they also have regional leagues where they can also mine talent from. So I guess that is also my concern in terms of competition. And territory in Europe also seems like it would be just a mess in terms of different, like I know already there have been teams that have issues with different laws in different countries regarding taxes, regarding player visas and stuff like that. So I just don't...
Yeah, there are different taxation laws depending on what European country you're in.
Yeah, and I just don't see why this has to be every region, I guess, is my thing. Like, I can understand why you'd want to do it in NA, but...
I think NA is actually really difficult because you have a smaller fan base, right? Just speaking to the geographic location stuff, like the franchising thing in NA is maybe okay because we aren't seeing new orgs come in and things like this. And I mean, the owners have really pushed for it anyway. But just the geographic location thing would be really difficult because you have to basically internalize your entire practice system, your entire training system. You have to have a second team to scrim at all times. So the amount of players that you're signing to your roster increases. And the quality of practice you can get might not be the same because the ping will be different depending on where you are. It's more difficult to scrim East Coast teams if you're a West Coast team. I mean, they did centralize the servers, but then you're constantly playing your scrims on live instead of TR, which I think a lot of teams moved to TR because of the issue with the ping, with the servers initially moving to Chicago. Yeah. So that no longer becomes an option for you in this situation. So
I also don't see a lot of... So, like, not only is the North American player base smaller, but I don't see a lot of incentive to geographically relocate for fandom reasons as well. I guess the idea is that kind of similar to what the Chinese owners hinted at, where you go there and then you can build a fan base. But I don't really see a lot of North American organizations doing that. Just because I think it's, again, esports fan bases aren't something that rely on territory. And I also don't think that, say, if a team wants to rely on their traditional sports label for whatever reason, most esports teams actually haven't. But say if they did once they moved to a city or whatever, I don't see that helping esports orgs necessarily. And then the other weird thing about it is the talent itself. So like in most franchising systems, there's an existing talent pool and then something that feeds up into the professional level. So as much as I dislike a lot of stuff that goes on in NCAA football, like not paying their players, I think that you get a lot of talent coming up from that, and then there's a draft. Similar with the NBA, there's a draft. With baseball, it's a little weird because sometimes you have players entering from high school and then going straight into the minor leagues, but there, again, is also a draft. And these are all sports that have a pre-established, like, for lack of a better word, player base of kids growing up already playing it. I don't really see that existing with League of Legends, and I also still think it's very difficult to find more than like a very small percentage of the North American player base that you would want to kind of boost up. And then additionally, as, and you can speak more to this in China, because I think China has, if not like a more competitive, I mean, I would argue it's more competitive, but it's a more successful like secondary system, because the challenger system right now in North America is not the greatest, and it's not necessarily a good way to mine players up. And then they've also started a bunch of like collegiate, basically, I mean, collegiate's growing, but it's basically like a club system. So I just see like these weird like pockets of talent everywhere, and none of them are interconnected. And so when I see like NA is going to implement franchising, the owners are used to it. I don't mind that part, but another thing that concerns me is where the talent is going to come from. Because at the very least, because China has LSPL and TGA are merging together, right?
Kind of, yeah. It's still not clear on how that's exactly working. I'm assuming because TGA isn't just TGA. When you qualify for TGA, you're basically placing at the top of your province league. So I don't really understand how that's gonna fully come into effect, because TGA basically just happens once every split to qualify teams to LSPL from like the City of Heroes circuits. So that's a little bit weird to me, because you're having like city-based leagues already in existence, right? That are suddenly allegedly going to be integrated into LSPL somehow. And then the really weird thing is, because of organizational loyalty, I feel like it becomes even harder to farm talent, because like what is the incentive then for these LSPL teams to farm talent in general? Like, is it going to be every LPL team has to now have an LSPL team? And if you have, okay, so I have to back all the way up to explain this, and I don't know if it's like going to be super value added, but let's try to make it really, really simple. So contracts in China, like player contracts themselves, it's not uncommon for them to be 5 years. Okay, it's not uncommon for them to be your entire career. All right, so that's the first really big issue. And the way they rationalize it is they want your brand to be associated with their org. And when you retire, they want to have the option of maybe having a place for you among staff, or to do some other kind of work. And this is like their rationalization, is that they're making a lifetime investment in you.
That's actually really smart from orgs. Like, just to interject, because esports in general, and another thing I hadn't touched upon was that people don't always, or like more often than not, they go for players rather than teams. So, I mean, it's not the best thing for the player, but that's actually really smart from orgs.
Yeah, and so that's also why like sometimes the buyouts for Korean players in LPL are voided, because if you want to go to a foreign team, so like if you come to the LPL, you're associated with that Chinese org that you sign with, and you can have this monstrous buyout. But if like a foreign org wants you, and you want to go to the foreign org, they're not going to say, oh no, the foreign org has to pay this like same monstrous buyout. No, they're gonna let you go, as long as when people think of you in China, they think of LGD, EDG, whatever. So they're fine with that. But the problem with that is that how then like do you get players from LSPL to LPL? And that has been a persistent problem, is that getting talent from LSPL to LPL without the LSPL team itself qualifying for LPL, like this is one of the frustrating things when you watch LPL and you see like these really ridiculously bad bottom lanes that they're struggling with, and they're subbing in like other players from all this stuff, and then you watch an LSPL team like Dan that just qualified, who, so they're no longer an LSPL team, who have a really strong bottom lane. You're just like, why isn't this in LPL yet, you know? But it's like really hard to transfer that talent. So what are you going to do then to get the talent from LSPL to LPL if there's no option for promotion eventually, right? And how do the LSPL contracts change? Do the LPL teams start having like permanent spots in LSPL to make this a possibility? Because then they have to farm these players. And when they do that, because of the way that they've chosen to structure teams as separate entities, you can't take players from LSPL and have them play on the LPL teams in the same split. Like, so what then identity does LSPL have in China is the question that I keep asking, and no one has really given me a good answer.
Which is, so in 2015, I'm sure you know this, but for those people who don't, basically prior to the sister team merger, Korean teams typically had 2, sometimes 3 teams, and whether they were in champions honestly just depended on how good they were. And if they were not good enough, they dropped down to this other tournament that ran concurrently called the NLB, and teams that dropped out of champions would also be seeded into the NLB as both tournaments kind of went on. And 2015 changed all that. And for the first half, they did this weird thing where they were like, well, you can have 10 people on your roster, and then the bench is going to kind of play in Challenger. And it was just this unholy mess of like teams trying to have like their Challenger bench and then also have other Challenger teams like coming up, and basically they stopped it after a year or a split, I think.
I mean, LPL also had the Reserve League last split, and I was actually really sad that they got rid of that because there were players like Intruder who were actually coming into the LPL from the Reserve League system, so I thought that if they had let it go for a little bit longer, then it would have been successful. But then again, what does LSPL do when you introduce franchising if you already have a Reserve League system? So it's really awkward.
Yeah, I guess my hope, so like, I don't know how far they've thought about this, but like, my hope would be that they would have, but I mean, while teams are promoting, it makes no sense, so I'm not sure how they'd even go about doing it, but like, the end game, I guess, for me would be every team could have, it would be like a minor major league system, basically, where every team would have a team in like LSPL, and then they'd have a team in LPL, and they'd be able to swap players between both rosters if one player was struggling or they felt like a certain lineup did, performed better. And obviously there are like pluses and minuses to that, but I think ultimately you might actually be able to farm talent a little bit better. I don't know even how that would work when it comes to North America. I would kind of hope they'd implement something similar, because right now the Challenger system is kind of
failing. I think we can all agree that the North American Challenger series is by far
broken.
The most disappointing secondary series in. I don't know. No, LMS still is promoting teams, I guess. It's just really, really not a good thing in North America right now.
Yeah, and I mean a lot of it. So for some players, like I still do think in North America you do have the best domestic talent usually does rise to the top, and then they are taken by a team in the LCS. But the league itself isn't, it's just not, it's broken. It doesn't really work well. So we're kind of running out of time a bit, but do you have any other thoughts in terms of how this is going to work in China? Because I know LGD sounded a bit surprised that it wasn't being implemented in all regions, but it's looking like China's definitely going to be the first guinea pig.
Yeah, I think that there are a few people who are saying, oh, China's weird and completely different, so we can't necessarily learn anything from how it works in China. I don't think that that's necessarily true, because I think they do surprisingly still have some of the same problems that people don't expect them to have. Like the question of can you build followings in every city that you go to every week enough to fill stadiums? Because I go to the LPL during the regular season, and even in like week 8, 9, 10 or something, we're not filling the consistent LPL venue in the major city Shanghai. So are we going to fill venues in Chengdu? Are we going to fill venues in some of these or smaller like Suzhou? Are we going to fill venues in some of these like smaller locations? So that's kind of my concern there, and I think that's a concern that's applicable to places like NA that have really much smaller fan bases.
Yeah, it's definitely a concern in LA in NA, just because the LA studio is usually packed whenever it's like the most popular teams. But especially when it gets to like the mid and late season, it kind of rises in popularity again because you have teams like vying for playoffs. But like that mid-season lull, there will be like, especially in the secondary like smaller arena, it'll sometimes be like a really sparse crowd.
Right, and I also think that staggering the implementation in different regions is actually really going to hurt LPL in terms of international competition. Be my other one is because if you're adding the extra burden of travel every week, but only to one region, that's less time for them to practice. That's more stress on one particular region's teams. And that's why it makes sense for the LTD owner to be a bit surprised that it's only implemented in one region so far, because that is, I think, an inherent disadvantage when it comes to eventual international competition and the regions and teams' ability to develop.
All right, I'm sure we probably could have talked even more on that, but that's kind of the short summation of our thoughts on the upcoming LPL franchising. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kelsey, at like what is now probably 3 a.m. or 3:30 a.m. And you can check out all of our other content on Yahoo Esports. Thank you.